So it's a great honour and delight to have a chance to talk to William Waldegrave. Thank you very much for enabling this conversation. I should mention that this is being done under the flight path to Heathrow Airport, and therefore there may be moments when we can't hear much, but let's proceed by asking the first question which I ask everyone, which is when and where you were born.
I was born on the 15th of August 1946 in my parents' house at Chewton Mendip in Somerset. The youngest of 7 siblings, the only one to be born post-war. My brother, who was the nearest, was born in 1940, and my 5 sisters were born in the 1930s. I usually go back to grandparents, but in some cases further back, and it would be very nice if you could tell me something about your link to the Walpoles. Yes, well, the Waldegrave family itself is always described in 17th century genealogies as ancient. We were of the minor aristocracy, but and in the very early days post-conquest, senior landed gentry of East Anglia, with, as many English families, one of those family trees which starts with Warren de Waldegrave coming over with the Conqueror and marrying his cousin in order to redeem the family lands already here, which I think is a pretty good propaganda story by the Normans. But we were about in the 12th century as Sheriff of London and the 3rd Speaker of the House of Commons, and then prominent in knighted on the field of that dreadful battle at Towton Moor, and prominent under Mary Tudor, where we became national, and then again under the Stuarts, married off to an illegitimate daughter of James II, a daughter he had by Arabella Churchill, and then into the higher aristocracy, having gone into exile, came back in 1723, having negotiated their way back, changed religion, a step up in the peerage to an earldom, and then sent straight back, more or less straight back to Paris to spy on Berwick, his first cousin, and so on, and close confidant and public servant in the period of Robert Walpole. Then the niece of Horace Walpole, Horace's elder brother, Edward. It's a story, I think, which shows why we didn't have a revolution in England as in France. Edward Walpole, a fairly idle son of the great Prime Minister, had chambers, I think, in Pall Mall above a milliner's shop, and in the milliner's shop was a pretty girl, and in France we would know how the story ends. In England what happens is that they live, the pretty girl and Edward Walpole, happily together for 30 years until they both die. They produce a daughter, Maria, who marries first James II Earl Waldegrave, the grandson of James II, the King, and at that time a powerful figure in national politics. When James II Earl Waldegrave dies, Maria Waldegrave by then marries the King's brother, the Duke of Gloucester, the man who said, "Scribble, scribble, scribble, Mr. Gibbon." And so from the milliner's shop to the King's brother is a matter of a few decades, which, although it caused a bit of a stink, and there was one of the things that contributed to the passing of the Royal Marriages Act, it was possible in England and not possible, in my view, in France. And so anyway, this girl, formidable girl, Maria Walpole, who first married James II, was Horace's favourite niece, and she was quite a character, much painted by Reynolds. And she had left these Waldegrave children. She produced the famous 3 Ladies Waldegrave, painted by Reynolds, a commission undertaken by Reynolds for Horace Walpole at Strawberry Hill, the picture hung at Strawberry Hill. And one of them married the first cousin of Waldegrave, which is why it goes down through that line. Anyway, Horace became very fond of his niece, fond of her children, and left Strawberry Hill and all its collection in his will, a life interest to Mrs. Damer, a cousin of his, a sculptor. Mrs. Damer gave it up early, and then permanently to the Waldegrave family. I think because he thought the Waldegraves, great survivors for centuries, were a safe bet not so rich that his possessions would be swamped in a great collection like Chatsworth or something, and good survivors. Unfortunately, we then hit a very bad patch and had two terrible Regency characters who did a sale at Strawberry Hill in 1842, scattering the collection to the four winds. So poor Horace's intention failed, although he knew it would fail, because in his 1784 description of Strawberry Hill, he says, all great collections get scattered, as my father's did, almost out of Europe. Of course, his Walpole's pictures were sold to Catherine the Great by another of his elder brothers. And he says, I've described my own poor collection so that when they're scattered, they may have a genealogy, not so good as the peerage, more like a race, right, more like racehorses. So he was an antiquarian collector who then came an extraordinary episode in my family, because these two ne'er-do-well brothers who did the sale, both of them, one after the other, married a wonderful young adventuress, a Jewish girl called Frances Bren. One died of drink, so then she married the other one. She then made herself, it gives Becky Sharp a complete lesson in social climbing, she then makes herself one of the great Whig liberal hostesses of the mid-19th century. She marries very well, again ending up married, she marries 4 times in the end, married to Lord Carlingford, who was in Gladstone's cabinet, and she makes Strawberry Hill a major centre of liberal politics. She's described by Disraeli as the real leader of the opposition. She buys back a lot of things because our little estate in Somerset, which had been given us by Mary Tudor for the lead mines, now began to produce coal, so she was rich for a bit. So then there was a sort of restoration a bit then. But that sense of guilt about the destruction of Horace's collection by my family in 1842 is why I tried to collect a few things back myself.
Wonderful. Well, usually one doesn't go back quite as far in history as that, but that's great. But we've only got down to the 1870s. What happened after that?
Then my great-grandfather, I am descended from the younger son, born posthumously, of my great-grandfather, who was killed at the Battle of the Alma as Lord Chewton, leaving a pregnant widow. His elder son became a rather conventional and not particularly attractive sort of high Tory pheasant shooting figure at the turn of the century, chief whip in the Lords at the time of the constitutional crisis in 1911, and a last ditcher, resigned in disgust at the compromises that were made and went back to shoot pheasants. He had a son who died of multiple sclerosis without producing a child himself. It then went across to the younger son, who was a Church of England vicar, and who produced my father. So the line was very thin then, and my father was brought up in the uncomfortable position of having an intimidating old uncle with a crippled, dying son, knowing that he was going to inherit from his uncle a very uncomfortable childhood, lived in no great prosperity at all in various vicarages, and he inherited in the earldom finally in 1930, married my mother, a Grenfell, of the great imperial Grenfell family, liberal imperial family, and her mother was a Littleton, another such family. Littletons and Grenfell cover the place at Eton where we are with war memorials and achievements and so on. They have everything from VCs to governors of the bank to they were the sort of high liberal imperial families, along with many others. But my Grenfell grandfather, was alternately very rich and very poor. He made 2 great fortunes and lost them both. So he died. His last great speculation was chrome mines in Yugoslavia. And I was brought up with the old boy sitting in an armchair, still bankrupt, paid for by my father, saying, "Bloody fella Tito," because Tito nationalised his chrome mines. And he was a fine old boy of the Grenfell family. 2 of his brothers and two who were twins were killed in the First World War, one winning the VC. His first cousin was Julian Grenfell. 8 or 9 of them were killed in the First World War. He had the DSO and was badly wounded. They were classic of that generation that suffered in the First War, and somehow went indomitably on.
Mm. Your grandmother's family, you said, were...
Well, my mother's mother was Hilda Littleton.
Mm. Wasn't related to the mathematicians, Littleton.
It's related to Braithwaite.
Oh, yes.
And related to Edward Littleton, who was headmaster at Eton, and to the old Littleton family, who turn up in history, but reached a great...
When you say Braithwaite, do you mean Richard Braithwaite?
Richard Braithwaite,
who
yes.
I shared a room with. That one.
Did you? Well, his mother was a Littleton as well, and I knew him a bit. My brother knew him better when he was in Cambridge.
Yes.
A big man.
Yes. Coming down to your parents, tell me something about them as people and how that might have influenced you.
Well, they're very interesting, I think. My father was brought up in a tradition which has died really now, but was rather a fine tradition, of a sort of it's a kind of Tory conservatism that doesn't really exist anymore. You're deeply suspicious of free markets, hierarchical, Christian, much more sympathetic to socialism than to capitalism. I found amongst his papers a letter from Walter Citrine at the time of the general strike, writing to him saying, "Thank you, my lord, beautiful copperplate hand, thank you, my lord, for your support." A signer of the Peace Pledge in the 30s, a radical young man who believed in inherited wealth if it was made to work. My mother, long before the National Health Service, had clinics on the estate in Somerset and so on. So they took their noblesse oblige very seriously indeed, with a Christian background, as he'd been brought up as a child of the Church of England. High church, very high church. One of his sisters had never married because her young man was judged to be too low church, so there was no question of marriage. And so it was an interesting background. I was brought up, and then after the war, they were modernists in the sense that they pulled down the great Victorian house, they wouldn't be allowed to now, moved into quite a modest house described in Anthony Pole's diaries when he visits as not really suitable for an earl, but only for a country vicar. So it was not Anthony Pole. And they had no indoor servants or anything of that kind after the war. They lived, it sounds odd now to say it because they were rich, but they lived rather modestly. They didn't have flashy cars, they didn't go to the south of France. All the money that was made on the estate, and farming was good in the 50s and early 60s, was mostly invested back in the estate, in improved houses and so on. So I was brought up with a strong sense of public duty, although at the same time, of course, a sense of local hierarchy. I mean, I was the son of the relatively big house. Everybody in the village lived in our houses, though many of them do sold now. Most people in the village were employed by my father on his farms or in his cheese business, which he started. But he was intensely proud of the small businesses he helped to start with his people. It was an old-fashioned paternalist, but rather admirable world. It could never exist again. It reminds me of some of the things in the world we have lost. There's a picture of me.
Peter Laslitt's book.
Peter Laslitt's book. There's a picture of me, which I've got somewhere, handing out coronation mugs to the villagers who were lined up respectfully. This was a task for the younger son, my elder brother, much grander, who was a page at the coronation. I wasn't. I was deeply envious of his sword and his uniform. And the picture consists of the children of the village lining up in quite a respectful manner. I'm standing behind, aged whatever I was then, 6 or 7, behind the table with my governess on one side and the vicar, gentleman vicar, who I remember very well, with a waistcoat and a gold watch chain and a trilby hat, who's reading the list of the children. And it's extraordinary to think that that's in one lifetime. I didn't go to...
Well, tell me just first about your mother as well.
My mother was a scolamonche, really. She was at St Paul's Girls' School and went up to Somerville on a full scholarship, and then left Somerville to marry my father, which I think she probably regretted later in life. But she, with her father, having been this extraordinary roller coaster ride of great riches, one time he had number 1 Carlton House Terrace and a great house and a great picture collection, and the next moment he was bust.
How did he lose it all?
Oh, the first great fortune, a great company before the First World War called Select Trust. In the jargon of today, he was what was politely called over-geared, I think. Huge borrowings. The company was bigger than Cecil Rhodes's company at one stage. Then he fell off his horse hunting, was on his back with a broken back for 6 months, gave it to his brother to run, who was subsequently killed in the First War and won the VC, who was no businessman at all, and the whole thing was bust by the time he came. He owned that wonderful Titian of the Man with the Glove that's now in the Frick collection. And there's a letter from him, he had to sell that in 1916, I think. There's a letter from him in the from the trenches to Frick, saying, it's a little uncomfortable out here, but I hope you enjoy your new picture. You know? And you think of the sort of distance between the trenches and the ruthless old businessman Frick, who was buying pictures on the cheap in Europe. So she, I think, thought that to get stability by marrying my father young, that seems to me psychologically expectable.
And they'd met at Cambridge, had they, or not?
She was at Oxford. They must have met socially.
It was Somerville, Oxford, yes. Yeah.
But really, she then produced 7 children. The obvious search for an heir. She told me once that my father never, for a second, showed any sign of disappointment as yet another daughter appeared. But when my brother was born in 1940, of course the church bells were rung and so on, and it was a major event. And when I was born in 1946, I saw a letter from somebody to her saying, "Well done, you now have guarded your ace." So the production of sons in a family which had gone in a very narrow line, the Waldegraves, for a time, obviously was an achievement.
What about their actual characters as people, your father and your mother?
My father had elements of what would now be called bipolarism. He was subject to tremendous tempers. A depression over the Mendips, we used to say, as my elder sisters used to say when we were small. And he could be very frightening and uncontrolled in his temper. My mother was a rock-like, equable person, and she had taken the decision that, come what may, she was going to look after him, and was determined, incidentally, to outlive him, because she was sure that he couldn't live without her, which she was right. He lived to be, they both died, and she died 4 or 5 months after him, when finally he had died in 1995. He was 90, she was 86. And it was a marriage which cannot have been very easy for her at various times, because his temperament was difficult. He was capable, like quite a lot of such people, of putting on a wonderful show for outsiders. So people would say, what a charming man your father was. And he was a charming man, but you also saw another side of it, which was that he could get very, very depressed, and that took the form often of rage. And I, as the youngest, probably suffered from that much less than some of the others. I think some of my sisters were hurt by it, and my brother and he had a very poor relationship. There's a classic thing of poor relationships in landed families anyway, between the eldest son and the father. But it was particularly, and one of the things it did was to train all us siblings, me least possibly, but train them all in the avoidance of confrontation.
I was thinking about that.
When the signs of danger were about, people absented themselves or found strategies for avoiding. Was
this useful when you were in a cabinet with Margaret Thatcher?
Well, I was much younger than Margaret Thatcher. She's always extremely kind to me. But perhaps it did. I think I learned from it that there were times when you just had to put your head down and let the objects fly past you. And I was close to my father, even in his very difficult, very old age, because he was a remarkable man, disappointed in many ways. He was very intelligent, and he'd been sent up to read land management or something at Trinity, Cambridge. Always felt he was uneducated. He suffered another thing that happened. His brothers-in-law, my mother's brothers, all had rather heroic wars, and his son-in-laws, 3 of them, all had rather heroic wars. He never really, he was in the artillery and the air defences of Bristol for a time, but was sent to the British military liaison mission in Washington at the end of 1941, and always felt as such people sometimes did. He was 36 or something, so it was not surprising. That he felt he hadn't done his bit in the war, or at least he felt overshadowed by the Bernard Fergusons and the Patlock Phillipses and the brothers-in-law, the Campbell Prestons, who'd all been conventional soldiers.
Let's now move on to yourself. What is your first memory? Not perhaps just of trees waving above you, above your pram, but concrete memory.
Well, my childhood was much more in many ways like being an only child than the member of a big family, because by the time I became conscious, my elder brother was at prep school, boarding school. I was educated before prep school by a governess at home with one other little boy, the son of the head of the Theological College in Wells, which then existed. And I had quite a lonely childhood in a way. My early consciousness is a lot to do with looking forward to siblings coming home in the holidays. Quite a lot of the others of my early memories are to do with the physical things at Chewton. I do remember the sound of the tremendous peal of church bells at Chewton from a very early age, with the room in which little bedroom which I had opposite my parents' bedroom, which was a very early bedroom. It doesn't now exist in the house. It turned into a cupboard later. My mother never had believed in nannies. She had the governess, but she never believed in nannies. So there was no. The bond with my mother was always extremely strong, and remained strong till her dying day. I remember noises and things. I remember the noise. I was talking to one of my contemporaries in the village the other day, saying, I remember this rumbling noise, and I remember the walls being knocked down in the turnpike road at the bottom of the garden. And he remembered exactly the same thing, American tanks on tank transporters going home when the Americans began to dismantle their bases, and they did knock down all the walls. I remember the empty big house, the big Victorian house, which we never moved back into after the war, which was off limits because it was dangerous. It had been used by the American army in the war and largely destroyed. I remember that post-war feeling of there being mysterious, all the woods had the remains of concrete and barbed wire and mysterious overgrown things in them, and that very strong overhang of the war, which although when I grew up was very near, somehow was already mythic and heroic. And my elder sister's early boyfriends, had fought, and their husbands in the end, had flown in bombers, had been in battles, and but it felt strangely as far away as the Trojan War. And I wrote a newspaper. I was a precocious child, I suppose, which used to exist somewhere. I don't know where it is now. On a typewriter, which I still have, an Imperial portable typewriter. And so when I was 5 and 6, which I used to sell to my children, and it was a mixture of what you would expect of sort of science fiction, rockets and things, but a little bit of precocious politics that I must have been hearing. Mr. Bevan was a very alarming figure. And so, but it was, in spite of the background of intermittent terror when my father was angry, which affected me much less, I think, than the elders. It was a very happy childhood, and very protected, and very with a cook and daily ladies who came in, all of whom were great friends, and so a very friendly and comfortable but somewhat lonely childhood.
It was obviously a country childhood. Did you sort of fish or gather
Yes.
birds' eggs or?
Both those things, and moths, though I was never very competent at these things. I found the remains of my moth collection. There were only about 2 different kinds of moths, so I only caught very common ones. There were birds' eggs, but they were mostly thrushes and blackbirds. When I was 12, I was allowed to have a 410 shotgun, and I remember, just as in Beavis, I remember the great day when I shot my first pigeon. No horses much. My mother had broken her back riding, though some of my sisters rode a bit. We were never encouraged, and it was never encouraged much to have anything to do with the hunt, because I think my mother thought it dangerous, and my father characteristically had intelligent and wayward ideas about fox hunting. He thought it unfair to hunt a nocturnal animal during the day, and never had much time for that. There was a kind of intelligent sort of landed intellectual aristocracy, which is hard now to conjure up. He had all kinds of really quite radical ideas. He was strongly against it. I think both my parents, my father didn't have a vote, my mother certainly voted Liberal in 1945. They both brought me up to believe that it was a very good thing Churchill hadn't been re-elected. We would have had a dictatorship, and we would have gone to war with the Russians, and goodness knows what would have happened. They were strong supporters of the creation of the welfare state, though I was also hearing Mr. Bevan's a very dangerous man, but then that might have been because they were supporting Attlee at the time.
And that's fascinating. You had a governess and a private teacher.
I went to prep school at aged 8, but I had a governess before.
Where did you go to prep school?
I had a not very distinguished prep school called Pinewood near Shrivenham, which was because the Astor family liked it. My uncle Reggie Grenfell was married to Joyce Phipps, who was part of the Astor.
The Joyce Grenfell.
Yes, a wonderful background figure in one's childhood, and she was part of that set. So they said it was a good school. It wasn't a practically good school, but I had the essential thing: a teacher who taught me to read, Mr. Vallon, and to write a bit. An art master who didn't mind, who encouraged huge poster paintings. And the tradition at the school was most of the activity was building mud huts and tree houses. Relatively
quite a liberal, open sort of school.
Yes, an open. I went back to see it the other day. They asked me when I became Provost of Eton to speak at their speech day. It seemed measurably smart, and you're always supposed to think that places look very small when you go back. It looked much bigger to me, much grander, and of course co-educational modern now. It was, but I remember it with some affection. It taught me a little bit of Greek, it taught Latin well, it taught mathematics well, and it taught me to read, and it had books in its library.
You didn't feel very homesick when you first went there?
I'm sure I did, yes. But my brother had been there earlier. It seemed to me that it was the natural thing, it didn't strike me as a surprising thing to do. Later on, my mother told me it was the worst day of our life when I went to boarding school. The last of her children, last of 7 children.
Worst day of her life or your life?
Her life.
Her life.
Sending me away. And in modern times, I don't know why I couldn't have gone to the cathedral school in Wales, for example, but that was the tradition. And it was all right. And I was a moderate performer, began to do better towards the end, and to my astonishment, when I did the common entrance for here, was placed in the remove here in those days, which was meant that one had missed out a whole year. That seemed to me very wrong. I was extremely shy at this point. It may seem difficult to imagine for someone who then became a politician, but I talked very little and was very, very anxious, as I think the youngest of large families often are, not to be made a fool of, and not to make. So the best strategy for that was to keep quiet. I remember an episode when I can't have been more than about 8, I should think. When I was, and I could locate this episode exactly. We were in a taxi with several of my older sisters, going past the Queen Victoria Memorial outside Buckingham Palace, going somewhere, but I don't know what. and my sisters were ridiculing some young man who had said it was one of Beethoven's best violin concertos. I didn't know what was wrong with this remark, and I remember almost promising myself, I am going to put myself in a situation where I never don't know what is wrong with remarks like that.
Were you a sporting person at all?
Not very, no. Pretty hopeless. I played a little bit of cricket, but no, I was never. My brother was a sporting hero. Rode stroke the 8 hero, stroke the 8 at Cambridge, and the boat race for 2 years, and was much worshipped by everybody. I was plodding along behind rather. My brother rather generously once said, I began to flower a bit more when I was at Eton. I was never a great sort of spectacular intellectual, but I worked very hard. I used to write, I don't know whether it is proper Russian, but I had 2 slogans, Lavo Romnia Vicit from Virgil, and Trud Trudi Trud, which I thought was the Lenin slogan. I think wrongly that meant work, work and work in Russian. So I was a Stakhanovite, and I used to work genuinely very, very hard, and began to win prizes.
From what age?
From about 13 or 14 when I came to Eton, and began to compete. And I did row relatively successfully for a time, but I was never going to be as good as my brother, but I did row and did win some of the same school races as he'd won. And then I was allowed to do my A-levels, which you were in those days, early, when I was 16, and did very badly at them. And then I decided I must give up rowing, and I've still got a letter from the rowing coach at the school saying I was letting down the school by giving up rowing. And I concentrated very, very hard on both on getting good A-levels and trying to get a scholarship to Oxford and trying to win the Newcastle Prize here, all of which I then did, but not elegantly, not like Robin Redford, not like proper scholars. I did it by application.
Let's go back to the coming to Eton. Was it obvious that you were going to go to Eton? I mean, your family had been...
Yes, my family had... my father was a Wykehamist and hated it. But my mother's family had all been Eton heroes. Her father had been in the 11 here. They at Littletons and Grenfells had all been. And there had been Etonian Waldegraves before, one of whom was drowned as a little boy here in the 1760s, which caused them to boycott the school for a bit. But I don't think my father ever made a serious attempt to send me to Winchester because he didn't really care for it himself.
Do you remember coming to the school for the first time?
Yes, I do, because my brother was here. I was sent early. You could do that sort of thing in those days. I arrived when I was 12 in the house of a man called John Marsden, who was a rowing hero, commander in the war, a huge, tough man who'd won the Wingfield Sculls and goodness knows what, and beaten the Russians in a pair, in a double scull at Henley. Was a sort of... he wouldn't have been a schoolmaster nowadays. I don't know what would have become of him. Quite an eccentric, formidable man who I became devoted to rather. Not an intellectual man, but he knew what he didn't know. And I remember him when I was quite young, 14 or something, saying, "You need more intellectual stimulus." And finding a young master, a typical young master of the kind that Robert Burley used to apply, called Nigel Foxall. I met him again the other day now, a distinguished older man, who was a wonderful sort of aesthete, who'd come from Tübingen University. And I remember going into his rooms here, and he had a print on his wall. And his first remark to me was, "Who's that picture by a boy?" So I cannot think how this happened. Into my head floated the words Fantin Latour, sir. So I said that. Well, obviously it's Fantin Latour. He said, "No, what?" Now you said, the next thing he said was, "You remember in the Stones of Venice, Ruskin says," and I said, age 14, as one was allowed to, I think. "Do you know, sir, I've never read the Stones of Venice." "You've never read the Stones of Venice?" Anyway, the great thing about this school is that there are masters like that. And I was taught also by another formidable man who could easily have been a philosophy don at Oxford, called John Roberts, who was a very good gradesman and scholar from Oxford. And I was at the end of the time when, apart from mathematics, the highest prestige still attached to classics. All that changed not long afterwards, but so I went up the classical route.
Yes, I was going to ask which subjects really excited you?
Well, I used to win the English literature prizes, and I won the junior lower boy Rosebery. I used to win prizes. I was very competitive, and I was good at. I think I had an annoyingly, again because of elder siblings, I think I sounded much more mature earlier than other boys. So I wrote the sort of things that grown-ups liked earlier, I think. But I was never. I won all these prizes from sort of the age of 16, 17, 18 to the Prize Fellowship at All Souls, in every case feeling that this was
fraud.
Fraud, yeah.
How revealing. I mean, you said you worked very hard. Are there other features? There must have been a bit more than that. Do you have a good memory?
Yes.
Do you have...
I remember it as a tumultuous place. I mean, Eton at that time was in a strange state when I became a very senior boy. Anthony Chenoweth's Trench was headmaster.
Oh, yes.
The ruins of a great man who was an intelligent and fascinating man, but
he was reputed as a rather harsh disciplinarian.
Well, it was not exactly, it was complicated. He beat too many boys, he drank too much, but one was smart enough to see that this was somebody interesting who was damaged rather than and I was fond of him. But my great influence at that level was Robert Burley, his predecessor, who was an enthuser and an antiquarian rather than a historian, really. But his sermons always began, and we used to mimic them. I was just driving down through Dorset the other day, and I remembered that the glass in the little Tittlehampton church was the most remarkable in the whole of West Dorset. So I went to look at it, and off he would go. And he inspired one there. He described his ideal Etonian as being a member of the Atomic Energy Authority following the second lesson in his local church in the original Greek. And that's not a bad ideal, actually.
What else were you doing at Eton? I mean, drama, local
drama.
politics,
far
music?
Too shy to do that. I rode until I gave it up in order to concentrate on work. I became a tremendous sort of bureaucrat, really. I was president of POP, which is the president then self-electing of the sort of prefects body. I was captain of the Opidans. I edited the Chronicle. I was fluent sort of essayist. So I did all those sort of things, and had very close friends, usually slightly outsider friends. Charles O'Hagan, Charles Strachey, Jamie McCulloch, who died, who was the most talented sculptor and poet. And I was conscious always that I was not really a proper intellectual like these people like Derek Parfit or Edward Mortimer or Robert.
Was Derek? No, Derek was older than you.
A little bit older, yeah. Just above me were some spectacular intellectuals, Mortimer and Parfit amongst them, another fellow called Hazler, who never quite did it. There was a mathematical prodigy called Simon Norton, younger than me. But it was still the school. The school was still an old-fashioned place. It was the school described in Bernard Ferguson's book from the 1930s. Really, we had no top hats, but there was still fagging, there was still beating. I was a progressive campaigner against various things. I led a strike in my house against food once, and I campaigned against beating, refused to beat people when I was captain of my house and president of POP. And rather priggish youth, I think.
So just to finish off on Eton, I had two thoughts or questions. One was, looking back now as provost, back to that time at Eton, what do you think have been the main changes to the school since you were here, 40 years ago?
There are changes that reflect changes in society as a whole, in many respects, but it's a far more humane place. There was still beating of boys. There was a much greater remoteness from the outside world, particularly as a younger boy. You were not allowed to go to London or see your parents except on very limited circumstances. It was still teaching a curriculum, although it was beginning to be reformed at the end of my time there, which was descended at least from the Victorian curriculum. There was a classical side, the top division, the top class in the school, which was called A1, was a classics division. The grandest prize, which carried the greatest prestige, was a classics and theology prize, the Newcastle prize, and mathematics as the other. It was a little like the old Oxford of the double first in Gladstone's day, which mathematics and classics. You had to choose, as you did in the English education system as a whole, age 16, whether you went one way or the other. So that in curriculum terms now there's a far greater range. You meet boys doing ancient Greek and chemistry and so on, and classics is not. Though it still carries prestige, and we still have a formidable classics department, isn't quite the sort of centre of everything as it was in some respects. It was a world of glittering prizes, and that was the classics prizes were the most glittering. I remember one of my uncles, a sensible modern person, trying to persuade me to do PPE on the grounds that was a modern thing to do, which had decorated itself by trying to call itself originally, remember, modern greats, in order to follow the prestige of the real greats. But it never occurred to me really to do anything other than modern greats at Oxford, partly because I did love the classics genuinely and became fascinated with Plato and Aristotle and the pre-Socratic philosophers, and then with classical history. And I loved and still love with some of the great authors. So I was never a good enough linguist to be completely fluent as one should be, to be a real classicist. So that the curriculum was still really in origin a Victorian one. Discipline was still very pre-modern. Even though Burley was a liberal man, he was not interested in that sort of thing, and he didn't reform that aspect, though he started another fundamental reform of the school, which was that when he arrived, I think I'm right in saying about 70% of the teachers were Etonians, and about 60 or 70% of the children were the sons of Etonians, and both proportions were reversed by the time he left, which was the beginning of quite a fundamental change. So it's more humane, it's more Catholic in its curriculum interest, and of course a fundamental change which really took place just after I left, when Michael McCrum became headmaster, although there were beginning to be straws in the wind then, was that along with a number of the other Clarendon schools and other great independent schools, as the state abandoned the grammar schools and the direct grant schools and academic selectivity, to some extent the independent schools moved to fill that place. The academic entrance standards for Eton became much, much stiffer in the period after I left. When I came here, it was first come, first served. You put your child's name down at birth, and if it could pass common entrance, which was a pretty low hurdle, you got in. And there was a fourth form, so-called, with really quite, not very academically advanced children, really. Robert Burley used to say, I'm running a strange, socially selected comprehensive school, which in academic abilities he pretty near was. Now it is, and we've never in those days, apart from our scholars, our elite people, never have thought of competing with Manchester Grammar School or Wolverhampton Grammar School in the sort of top academic award. Now we're a much more academic school, still not a specialist academic school. We deliberately don't try and come first in league tables. In fact, we've withdrawn from league tables because we think they're misleading and foolish. But we are a much more meritocratic place, which means the provost receives a great many complaints from the grandparents used to the old system as to why their children are not getting in.
Thank you. The other question really is, what do you think, looking back now, Eton did for you, either positively or negatively, in shaping your life?
Positively, I think it did what it still tries to do. The DNA is still the same in the institution. It's rather, the analogy is something like, or the metaphor is something like a snake. The other way around, we keep the skin, but what's inside gets changed. It looks the same, but inside part of the continuing DNA that makes it the same institution is that and it matters what the doctrines, what the ambitions of a place are, even if they're not achieved.
Mm-hmm.
What is the ideology? The ideology here, often not met, is that you try to develop the individual in a whole range of talent. We're not particularly a sporting school, though we're good at some sports. We're not particularly an academic school, but we have very high peaks of academic life. We are delighted that we have a boy at the moment who designs and makes his own high fashion clothes. We have a pack of beagles, we have very good art schools, we have very good drama, we have very good music. The objective is to find something that everybody can do, even if it is not, it hasn't been done before, perhaps, like the boy designing his fashion clothes. But if it is that you want to be an Olympic rower, well, we can help you do that, as we've done for 100 years. So that the ideal is to try to find the individual skill of the student. 4 years ago, a fascinating, unknown wall painting from 1490 or 1500 was uncovered in the headmaster's chambers, a room which had been long covered by panelling, which is a very early secular wall painting. It has a large schoolmaster in the middle, with little boys sitting at desks, some paying attention, some playing with hoops, Winchester arms on one side, Eton arms on the other, reflecting our origins, and a quotation from Quintilian running across the top, which says that the job of the schoolmaster is to find the individual talents of the child, which was a very good motto in Quintilian's day, a pretty good motto in 1500, and remains our motto. So that would be one side of it. The other side, which is the side that irritates people most, is that, although it's important, I think, is to try to build people's confidence. Now, this can slip over into arrogance very easily, and Etonians are often accused of arrogance. But I noticed that my daughter, who teaches in difficult comprehensive schools, one of her constant battles is to raise the confidence of the children she's teaching and to show them that they have abilities that they can meet. And it's pretty deeply attached to the DNA of this place that you should be able to handle yourself in any situation. And that presentation, I mean, it sounds a little surface, it makes it too much the surface to talk about it being a presentational skill, but I write here, as my son did, as a shy boy, and left confident, perhaps overconfident in my case. Nonetheless, that I think is still an important thing to do, to show people they can be themselves, they can stand up and take their own choices. The downside, well, in my day, more than now, it was an inward-looking place. It had aspects of all the old novels and things. Most of the novels written by these institutions are always written by people who claim to be very unhappy here and so on. If one knew them, one sometimes missed the fact at the time. But David Benedictus was the scandalous novel of my day, The Fourth of June. There was a sort of homoerotic atmosphere about, much dissipated now because we're much more integrated into the outside world. There was a greater sense of distance, I think, from the world, partly because many of the people's parents came still out of a wider social structure which was much more hierarchical than now. And there was probably, I was trying to describe my father's old-fashioned sense of noblesse oblige. He would never have used the words, he thought they were ridiculous, but a sense of duty. But the other side of that were arrogant people who regarded the world as having them respect and living just because they were who they were. So the unpleasant aspects of it were that there were such, probably more people who were arrogant in that way than there are now. But it's the same place in some essential ways. The little bit of anarchy, it was very much boy-led. We were always rather proud of the fact that in those days we wholly elected our own prefects. That's been somewhat moderated now.
Was this POP? Or?
POP, yes.
What is POP short for? Is it POP?
Short for popina, which is allegedly a Latin word for a tuck shop. Because it was a debating society in its origins, and it met in a popina.
Yeah. I see.
And the element of anarchy here has always been attractive. There's a story in Roxburgh of Stowe's autobiography of him bringing a team from Stowe in the late 30s to play Eton, and they've been training, and this is going to be their big match. When they arrive here, nobody has any idea that the match is going to take place. They find a polite boy who says, "Oh, well, I'll see if I can find someone to play." They can find 10 people. So Stowe win the soccer match 25-0 or something. Eton are frightfully polite to them, but don't take it all very seriously. Now, in the wrong set of hands, that can be arrogance. In the right hands, it can be a certain degree of muddle and freedom, which is rather attractive.
That's very nice. Well, we'll probably come back to Eton later in your life, but moving on now to university. You said you won the Newcastle Prize, but that's a local prize, isn't it?
That's a local prize.
But did you win a scholarship to?
I won a scholarship to Corpus Christi College, Oxford, which in those days the system worked. You did an examination, a university examination, scholarship examination in the autumn, and Corpus was a famous classical college, Edward Frankel and so on, were there. But I was attracted to it because one of my boyhood heroes was Isaiah Berlin, who had been in Washington with my father in the war. And though I didn't know him well at that time, he was a sort of intellectual presence, and he'd been at Corpus. And it was a small college, and I thought there were no Etonians, so when I left here, I rather consciously went through a sort of de-Etonianising phase a bit. And this was the 60s. I went up to an Oxford where 70% of the undergraduates were from the state system. It didn't seem that Etonians had inherited the world, or the William Club was other than a relic of the past. And, a better Oxford, actually, than it became in the 80s and 90s in some ways, I think. Corpus was a very meritocratic college. It was classics and medicine. It had no politicians, although I knew already I was very politically aware. It's had lots now. Miliband's were both there. And I also slightly consciously chose a small college because I thought I've always been attracted by the idea of community. And I don't regret my choice at all, though Christchurch people pretend to think that Corpus is part of their backyard or something. But it's a beautiful college too, with a strong sense of its own history.
When you said you were already politically aware, this may be unfair, but I think it was your sister who told my wife that she remembers you from the age of about 4 thinking that you might be Prime Minister.
Well, in my newspaper, I wonder, I suppose so. I certainly used to dream of when I was a small child and later, when often, as I said, alone, because my elder siblings were away at school or just away being much more grown up, my older sisters. I certainly had dreams in which I was at the centre of cheering crowds and so on. I think seeking applause is probably part of the psychology of being the youngest of an obstreperous family and of a big clan, because my mother had a good many brothers and sisters, so we were a clan of first cousins called Campbell Preston and Lord Phillips and Ferguson and those sort of things. And it developed. My father was a junior minister, not really a politician, in Mr. Macmillan's government between 58 and 63, so there were politicians about. He was an agriculturalist and was in the House of Lords as a junior minister. But I knew Alec Douglas Hume. There was a political background, and Mr. Macmillan was an early hero. My first political act was, in the sense of political act in a sort of public sense, a mini act, was to write to Ian MacLeod in support of his objections to the introduction of the first Commonwealth Immigration Act. I remember MacLeod rebelled about that.
When was that?
That must have been about 61 or 62, somewhere around there.
So you're about 11 or 12?
Something. No, it must have been after I arrived here, I think so, probably. it must have been, yeah, well, 61 or 62, yes, so I was 13, 14. And I had high ideals of the British Empire succeeding the Roman Empire, Civis Romanus Sum, and what was wrong with having everybody here. So there was a liberal Tory sort of background in my life, and I became more and more politically interested here, and went in for the Conservative Association, which I became president
Here?
of. No, at Oxford.
Oh, at Oxford.
I was a poor debater. It was another thing I forced myself to do. I was a very poor speaker. I never became a very good debater. I can do a quite separate thing, like Noel Allen could. I can do little after-dinner speeches and tributes at funerals and things, but I was never a really good knockabout debater, like Kenneth Clark or Little N. Michael Foot or Ian Powell or any of those great debaters. But I forced myself to do it a bit here, though I wasn't particularly renowned for it. Forced myself on at Oxford to join the union and make myself do it, because I then thought that was a skill you had to have. And became president of the Conservative Association, became president of the union, rather to my astonishment. And again, luck, because the left was still part of the Oxford Union at that point, and they withdrew just after my time, protesting that it was a club and therefore the Students' Union was the real thing. But they were still part of it just when I became president. Tory had been president not long before. But again, there were no great speakers in my I was quite lucky. There had been some very fine ones not long before.
So Oxford, you read greats.
Mods and greats. To my great chagrin, I didn't get a first in mods. And quite deservedly. I was not a good linguist. Mods is to some extent a language-based course, probably a little more then than now. There was still more reliance on measuring your capacity to write and read Greek and Latin fluently. But I was very disappointed by that. My dear tutor, who just retired the other day, Ewan Bowie, was one of my tutors.
What was his name?
Ewan Bowie, B-A-W-I-E, told me that, this is quite false, but it was a kindly thing to tell me. Just the other day he told me that year, out of the 11 people going in from Mons, Corpus, 9 of them got firsts.
Gosh.
He claimed that when the W comes at the bottom of the alphabet, and when they came to yet another one from Corpus, they said, we can't give them all first. I don't think this can be true, unfortunately, because I think the scripts were anonymised, but it was a kindly thing to say. And I was very well taught, first by Richard Nisbet, who became Professor of Latin, then by Ewan Bowie, and then a central person in my development was Jim Urmson, my philosophy tutor. This was the just dying heyday, but it was still a heyday, if you can have the end of a heyday, a whole evening of the dominance of Oxford philosophy. The great names were Hare and Ryle, and Hare was at Corpus, and Austin, and Wisdom from Cambridge, and the later Wittgenstein rather than the earlier Wittgenstein. Plato, Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle was an honorary Oxonian, and the Nicomachean in ethics at the centre of everything we did. And it was a very good education, in my view, alongside very good history teaching, Ronald Syme and great men, and teaching that.
Was Brian Harrison at Corpus then?
Harrison was at Corpus later, but I got to know Brian a bit.
Yeah.
And it was a very fine intellectual training, but fascinating, and I don't regret it for a moment. To have learned the economics of the day from Samuelson and so on might have been useful, but it would have been not much more use to me as a politician than knowing about the history of first century Rome or 5th century Athens. I do regret not learning more of the history of my own country, which I've taught myself a bit since, but I really knew no history at all after the death of Marcus Aurelius, until a good deal later. I lived in Corpus itself to start with, and then in a wonderful building on Folly Bridge, which was an imitation castle built by a local businessman in the 19th century in order to keep up with the colleges. And though it's difficult, if you look at my background, it must seem to any analyst that I'm somebody from the centre of the British establishment, but I never felt like that. I always felt that I was an outsider of some kind. I never felt, looking at the grand Etonians of the day, Robert Cecil's and the cool young men who were all Dev's delights and so on. I never felt like that. I never had sort of grand establishment. Well, I did have one grand establishment girlfriend, but she was a rebel. And my main girlfriend at Oxford was a Lancashire girl who had nothing to do with the university, really. And I always felt, I remember consciously thinking that my model was Disraeli, that I was going to be someone that these grandees would have to hire for their party. Of course, it was a lot of nonsense, but quite useful to make to feel, I think. It's a good motivating force to feel that you don't deserve anything necessarily, you don't inherit anything, you have to work for it. And I was never a member of the Bullingdon Club or those sort of things. The Union was more like a club then, perhaps, than later, but it was a political active club. And I didn't. My friends we had a massive electoral machines in AUCA, in the University Conservative Association. My college, being very small, had to make allowances, and my allowances were with Exeter and St John's and colleges which were then very meritocratic. Wolverhampton Grammar School was my main ally as an ex-school, and many of those people remain friends to this day. So it was seems odd to say that now, because at a surface glance, surely the second son of an earl had been to Eton and so on, must have felt. But if I'd felt like that, I would have gone to Christchurch or New College, and I would have. And I was very lacking in confidence. I never went to dead dances. I never went to stay at the country house weekends. I was extremely shy.
Still.
And rather aggressive.
Because you thought that it sort of implied that Eton had built up your confidence.
Well, it built up my confidence in some way. I was intellectually much more confident and rather explosively argumentative. And I must have been a pain in the neck, if you could feel. But socially, still really quite shy.
That's interesting. What about other things you were doing there? I mean, politics as an occupation, but drama, music...
I was told by my beloved teacher, John Roberts, at Eton, in his very solemn, pedantic way, I shall get it slightly wrong, but there were 5 things you could do at university: religion, sport, academic work, sex, and what was the 5th? What can the 5th have been? Perhaps there were 4. And anyway, you couldn't do 4, you had to choose one not to do. He recommended not doing religion, but I didn't really do any sport. I rode for my college in the Torpids for a year or 2. But I worked. I was never competent enough to do drama. I did politics, and I had my beloved girlfriend, whom I had never got my first in grades, because she completely looked after me. And the last year, I worked really hard. I worked 6 days a week according to a schedule, and
what was the schedule?
Very, very well.
What was the schedule?
Well, working through the great texts I had to do and the subjects, because greats is a very, very long public examination, still I think the longest public examination in the world. And then having time to revisit things. I had plans, I had a sort of space to read alongside things so that one could keep up with the latest thing. I've always been a good examinee. It's a technique, and a rather specious one really. But I knew, for example, that if one kept up with the very latest publications, that would probably impress examiners. Then, probably not now. Depressing to see the boys being told for A-levels here that you just have to use the key words that the examiners are looking for, and if you think of yourself, you'll get nowhere at all. I mean, Oxford, I hope, is still better than that. But, and I was very, very, very well prepared for grades and got a very good first. But by heavy lifting and hard work, rather than sort of, it's not an Oscar Wilde performance.
When you said you had to choose and you'd been suggested you didn't do religion, did you do religion?
Not really, no. My approach to the Church of England is very much like that of my friend Martin Rees. I feel it's my tribe, and I love the liturgy, and I love the language of the authorised version of the Book of Common Prayer, and I'm respectful of it. I get cross with. It seems to me that some of the propagandists for atheism make obvious mistakes. Equally, I don't like being pushed by evangelicals the other way. I like my relationship with something higher than the utilitarian world to be private, but I love the structure of the old Passion Church of England, which has rather fallen to pieces. And one of the very great pleasures of Eton is that our music, our liturgy is unchanged, and it's done on a high day very well indeed, in the ways that you'll find only in the great cathedrals elsewhere or other great colleges. And I find it very beautiful and satisfying. But if I'd been pushed intellectually at that time, or at Eton, I would have said yes, I was an atheist.
Well, that was what I was going to ask. I mean, what the fundamental... from how early do you think? You never went through a period, which people do in late adolescence, when they're confirmed. You were presumably confirmed.
I was confirmed. I went through a sort of mystical period, and I still regard myself as having elements of mystery and mysticism. I don't like entirely positivist explanations of things. I think they never fully satisfying. I would like to believe in ghosts. I would like to believe in mystery. I went through a period when I taught myself. I was quite the best. Another good side of Eton, which I perhaps failed to mention, was its encouragement for reading in all directions. I mentioned Nigel Fox, who directed me to read The Stones of Venice, which I didn't do from beginning to end. But I had a great period where I became deeply in love with the Arthurian legends and the poetry and writing of Charles Williams, Taliesin through Logos, and his mystical novels.
This was at Eton?
At Eton, yeah.
Because I went through that at Oxford.
Right. And I love those things, I still do, actually. So that as a part of my contradictory, I was a great believer in... Gilbert Murray had a theory about the inherited conglomerate, that we all inherit contradictory things, and it depends what we're doing at the particular time, which part of our belief system we use. And I'm quite superstitious, and I'm conscious of my intellectual side that that's nonsense, but I'm still superstitious. But I've never been formally able to commit myself to believing in Christian theology or anybody else's theology. Reading a little bit around the edges of Buddhism, which I don't think is really a religion at all. I find some of that interesting, and I don't want to. I don't want to live in a world where I'm told that rather naive reductionist science is all I'm allowed to feel.
So you don't hold with Dawkins? Dawkins
seems to me to be a slightly absurd person. Probably good at quite good at his science. I'm much nearer to those scientists who like to say that there are limits to what we can know. I fell in love with Immanuel Kant at one period. His metaphysics rather than his ethics, the concept that you live within the boundaries of understanding that, and you can't really speculate outside them. But I've never really committed myself long to any formal religion, though I get extremely upset if people try to knock over the Church of England or indeed any other generous religion.
When you said this mystical Charles Williams side, Charles Williams was part of a group, as you know, an Oxford group, C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers and so on, and on the edges, Tolkien not on the edge, but did that whole sort of fantasy world of those children's story writers?
Yes, my mother was interesting. She had strong views about what we should read, basically that we should read everything, but that there was only a limited amount of time to read. Her argument against pornography was it was just a waste of time, and there wasn't time to read. She was against the Narnia stories for a complex but quite interesting reason. And I never read them until I read them to my own children, because she said, if you want your Christianity, take it straight, not in children's stories. But she was very keen on the grown-up Lewis stories, That Hideous String, Screwtape Letters, Perilandra. And I've always loved mystical worlds. I'm a great fan of Philip Pullman, whose own approach to religion is not unlike mine in some ways, in that he's rather like, what's that great poem by Francis Thompson? You can hear the hand of God pacing along behind him. And he's a beautiful, magical storyteller, I think, owing much more to Lewis than he admits, actually. I didn't read Tolkien, the grown-up Tolkien. I read The Hobbit, but I didn't read the big series again until I was adult, but I like it. I like Private Worlds. I became a great fan and a friend of Patrick O'Brien, who wrote the cycle of stories about Nelson's Navy. I like enclosed imaginary worlds.
Well, that's perhaps a very nice point to go into another enclosed magical world of religion and the service at Eton. So, should we stop there?